So we're actually in the fourth week of a series called Pressed, and what we do here is we teach in series, so we'll take a particular theme or topic, and we'll focus on it for several weeks, 3, 4, sometimes 6 weeks in a row, and see what we can learn from it. And I hope that you have found this series helpful. I know that it's been helpful for me. I feel like God has been at work within me through the course of this series, and I'm excited to hear more and more of the way that He's at work through you as well in your life. And the reason why we're talking about this is because the studies and the statistics and the research tell us that over 90% of people in our country believe in God. And that's a pretty high percentage, right? I mean, that's an overwhelming majority of people say that they believe in God. But even though that many people say that they have a belief in God, how many of us really experience the God in whom we believe on a regular basis? See, it's two different things. It's one thing just to believe and to adhere to a belief and think that, yes, there is a God, there is an ultimate being, there is a creator. Maybe he started all of this, maybe he's in control, maybe not. But it's something else to say that we could actually experience that kind of a being, that kind of a person on a regular basis. And so the question that we've been asking throughout this series is, could we experience more of God in whom we profess when pressed, if we press into Him? What does it look like to press into an unseen God? I believe it's a burden for people to carry around a belief in a God, but yet not really experience that God on a regular basis. And that many people who say that they believe in God carry that burden, that they have this belief, but don't experience the God on a regular basis. Is there something that we can do that we can actually press into the God in whom we say we believe? Are there practices in our life that we can start, that we can make a part of our regular rhythms so that we can actually press into? Because that's a struggle to press into something that is unseen. Are there particular practices that might be helpful for us? And we've actually been looking at one text in particular, which comes from a teaching from Jesus. A man named Luke wrote this down. Luke was not an eyewitness, but he was a physician by trade, but turned journalist, and went and found all of this information and spoke to eyewitnesses of Jesus when he was here on earth, and fortunately for us, recorded it, and we have those recordings now thousands of years later. And we get to this point in the narrative that Luke shares with us, and Jesus is teaching. He's teaching those whom he has called to follow him. He's teaching those who have chosen to follow him. And he's teaching a larger crowd that has just gathered around him. And he tells people, he says, don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. And one of the practices that we focused on early in the series was the practice of forgiveness, and that we experience more of God when we emulate God. And that the story of Jesus is a story of forgiveness, and we get to live into that story. We make his story our story when we choose to forgive people in our lives. And Jesus continues, he says, give and it will be given to you. And then he says something really interesting. He says, a good portion or a good measure, pressed down, firmly shaken and overflowing, will fall into your lap. The portion or the measure that you give will determine the portion that you receive in return. Now, I've been telling you for several weeks that I was going to explain this to you because in the context that Jesus is speaking, there are people in the audience that would have fully understood what he meant by this. See, to us, we read this and it sounds good. A good portion, pressed down, firmly shaken and overflowing will fall into your lap. I don't know what that means, but it sounds good. All right, like I want that. I don't know what that means, but it just sounds good and I want it. But for Jesus, it had a specific meaning and it was a specific reference. So to the crowd that he was speaking, which would have been primarily an agrarian crowd, they would have had to go to the market, and the market was not like the grocery store that we go to today, but they would have gone to market to get whatever they needed for their homes. And for women in particular, they would go to the market and they would get the ingredients for whatever they were going to be preparing. And let's say, for example, they were going to go and get barley. That was something that they would have gone to the market to get. How's your barley? Everybody got some barley? You good on barley in the pantry? Not really something that we would fully understand today, but They would go to get barley, and you would have to go to the individual in the market that had what it was that you were looking for, hoping that they would be there on that particular day. And then you would tell them how much you wanted. Right? It didn't come prepackaged. So you would tell them how much you wanted, how much you needed, and they would measure out how much you requested. And what they would measure it into, they could simply measure it into whatever vessel they were putting the barley in, and then they would give it to you. But the people that were particularly generous in the market, the vendors that were particularly generous, had a way that they would measure out something like barley. See, what they would do is they would take the barley that they brought and they would put it in the vessel that they were using to measure it out, and then they would press it down. Because when you pour barley, there's still space in between the individual seeds, and they would press it down to make space. And then they would pour more in, and then they would press it down, and then they would shake it to make sure that what they pressed down fell in between the spaces of what was already in the container that they were using to measure it out. And they would continue to do this until it was overflowing and there was absolutely no more space left in whatever it is they were using to measure out the barley that you had come to market to get. So it would be overflowing. That was the generous vendors. That was the people that weren't trying to get more out of you than what they were giving you. And then they would take it, and the women, when they went to market, they would put on an outer layer, and they would fold that outer layer up. And then the vendor would pour whatever it is they were getting into that outer layer, and it would create a pouch on front of them. And that's how they would transport it back home. And that is how we got the fanny pack. I don't know if that's true. I just thought it's kind of, I don't know, it's coming back. Have you all seen the fanny pack? I don't know. I mean, for some of you, it never left, but I don't know if that's true, but that is true as far as the women going to the market and getting barley and putting it in a pocket. So this had a specific meaning to the audience that Jesus was teaching it to. And we don't go to market to get barley anymore, but we go to the grocery store to get ingredients for things that we are going to make. And for my family, one of our rituals, one of our patterns is to make pancakes. And many of you have heard me talk about pancakes. That's a big deal to our family. Actually, this year, we just started sports with our children. Our children are 6 and 4 and 2. One will be 5 this week. 6 and 4 and 2. And we just started organized sports. We put it off as long as we could, but we've got the 6-year-old, and we've got the 6-year-old and the 4-year-old involved now. And I almost said we could not play sports because it might interrupt our pancake making and our pancake time. That's how much it means to us. I'm like, sorry, you can't go and participate and learn things like, being a part of a team and athletic skill because we need our pancake time as a family. And these aren't any regular pancakes. These are chocolate chip pancakes. So it's really like dessert for breakfast, but it's okay because it's pancakes. And so every week we do pancakes, and we have to make them from scratch because we have some sensitivities in our family and some allergies, and so we can't just grab the mix off the shelf and add water or milk or however that works. And so we start from scratch and we put all the ingredients, and there are several utensils and containers and vessels that I use when I'm making the pancakes. And so one of them is this. I use this. It's just a teaspoon. You see, it's just a little guy there. For some of the ingredients, I use a tablespoon, which you can see is a little bit bigger there than the teaspoon. And then I use some actual measuring cups. And so I start with this. This is a half a cup, and use that for several ingredients. And then for the chocolate chips themselves, I use a cup. Not a half a cup, but a cup of chocolate chips. I know I have a problem, okay? I know I have a problem. I use a cup for the chocolate chips. And, chocolate chips, it's amazing because when you pour them in, there's space between them. I should start pressing them down and pouring more in and pressing and pouring until it's overflowing and into my lap. And use that for the chocolate chips. And then I used to, this was the largest container that I had that I would use to mix all the ingredients together when I was making pancakes. And so you can see I use several different sizes here of containers to measure and to mix as I'm making my pancakes from scratch. But then when we moved fairly recently, we had a housewarming party, and there were several people, including leaders here from 801 South, who came, and they knew of my obsession with chocolate chip pancakes. And one of the gifts that we received was this at that housewarming. And so now I use this, and it's amazing how many more pancakes we get to make and consume thanks to that gift from somebody here at 801 South at our housewarming. And so as I use all of these to make my pancakes, I measure out the ingredients. I wanted to use this because I thought maybe this could be a modern day application, because we're not going to go to market for barley, but we might go to the grocery store for chocolate chips. And as you think about the practices that we've been talking about, including the one that we're focused on today, but when we think about worship, when we think about forgiveness, when we think about what we pour out on those who are around us, if what Jesus tells us is that the portion or the measure that you give will determine the portion or the measure that you receive in return, whatever it is, which one would you want to pour out? Which one would you want to measure as far as your giving, if knowing that that is how you will receive? If you receive at the same measure and same portion at which you give, which one would you want to use here? Would it be this down here? If it's forgiveness, would you just a teaspoon of forgiveness? Just a teaspoon of forgiveness, or maybe half a cup, maybe a cup, because you know it's going to be more work. I mean, these are heavier, right? As you move up the line, it's heavier, it requires more. You have to fill it up more and press it down, shake it. It's tough to shake the heavier it is. All the way down here, you must have to use 2 hands when you lift that. So this is what Jesus teaches us. Which one, when we choose to forgive, if we choose to forgive, when we choose to worship, when we choose these practices of pressing, which one would you want to choose, knowing you're going to get in return however much you give, how you measure it out? What's the best way to measure these practices in life? This morning, we're going to move from one practice to another. How many of you, after last week, how many of you found yourself at some point during the week this past week? How many of you found yourself either at work or in the house when things were just kind of escalating and starting to get a little crazy, and all of a sudden you just broke into song? Anybody use that this week? I mean, I thought that would be like a helpful tool, like a real life application, right? That you could just start singing. I mean, you know, anything, Jesus loves me, Amazing Grace, I got that sunshine in my pocket. I mean, you can worship to Justin Timberlake, you know, right? I mean, right? Am I right? Thank you. You know, because we said we get to those moments last week when it's just crazy. We've had all we can take, and we're at a breaking point, and we're wondering where God is, and we can't see God, and we're viewing God through our circumstances, and all of a sudden we choose worship in that moment, and it elevates us and gives us a different perspective. And then we see God despite our circumstances that may or may not change. We see God in the midst of our circumstances when we worship, and the more that we worship, the more that we pour out our praise for Him, the more we receive and understand and alerts us to His presence in the moment, the practice of worship as a practice of pressing. And this morning we're going to move on to perhaps the most effective practice of pressing, but probably the least utilized. It's probably the most effective practice of pressing, but also the least utilized. And this morning we're going to focus on the practice of prayer. And prayer is such a funny thing. It's such a misunderstood thing. It's really not a natural thing for us, this idea of prayer, this idea of talking with God. And, you know, it's amazing. I'll talk to children about prayer. And I coach my son's soccer team. It's a bunch of 4-year-olds. We call it a soccer team. It's pretty generous. But it's a bunch of 4-year-olds, and I was asking them if they pray, and every single one of them said, oh, yeah, I pray. At some point, we lose that concept that prayer is maybe even possible as we get older, as we age and enter into adulthood. And a lot of times people ask, how do you pray? Is there a way that I'm supposed to be praying? Because I sometimes pray, and it feels like maybe I'm doing it wrong. And how do I pray? Is there a particular way to pray? And there's nobody who showed us more what it looks like to press and to lean into the Father than Jesus did himself in his time here on earth. And so what we're doing is we're really looking at the life and the practices and the rhythms of Jesus' life to see how he pressed into the unseen, to see maybe if we emulate him, could we institute some of these practices in our own lives to press into the unseen. And so when we look at the ways that Jesus prayed, because Jesus prayed, so if we look at the ways that Jesus prayed, maybe we can kind of figure out a little bit of the how to pray. And so how did Jesus pray? Well, Jesus prayed for children. If you look at how Jesus prayed for children. Jesus also prayed alone. So that's one way for us to pray, is when we are alone, we can pray. But Jesus also prayed with others. So he prayed alone, he prayed with others. Jesus also prayed short prayers. So, you don't have to pray really long prayers when you're talking with God, but Jesus also prayed long prayers. So you don't have to pray short prayers either. So when we look at how Jesus prayed, he also prayed often. And so you look at all these ways that Jesus prayed, and he doesn't really give us one particular way to pray in this short little survey, looking at his life, how he connected with the Father, how he was intentional. It gives us a clue, but there's not a prescribed way to pray, but he does teach on what to pray. So maybe it's not how we're praying, but it's what we're praying as a practice of pressing into the unseen. And one of the followers of Jesus actually comes to him, and he asks him to teach him how to pray. Luke tells us that Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when Jesus had finished praying, one of his disciples, one of his followers said, "Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." Now, John was a man who came before Jesus. You might know him as John the Baptist or John the Baptizer. He was a man that was sent to prepare the way for Jesus' coming. And he had followers as well that he taught, and apparently he taught them how to pray. And so this disciple of Jesus says, "Jesus, teach us how to pray." And it's interesting because he sees Jesus praying and thinks, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should learn more about that. He's emulating the one whom he's following. If you remember back at the very beginning of this series, we asked the question, who are you following? And if you're a follower of Jesus, who are you following? Who is following Jesus? And so this disciple looks at his teacher and says, "Teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." And here in this account from Luke, we get a piece of a famous prayer that I'm sure many of you have heard, if not prayed yourself, that we call the Lord's Prayer. That becomes a part of a lot of people's experience in church and even outside of church. I found out, I was having coffee with somebody just this past week, and this person was from Canada, and he said growing up, they would say the Lord's Prayer in public school in Canada every morning, along with their pledge or national song or whatever they do up there. I thought that was interesting, that in public school that they would say the Lord's Prayer. It was pretty much his only experience of God or religion, unfortunately, for him. And so Jesus teaches them, and then he says something after he teaches what to pray. He says, "And I tell you, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open." All of these actions that Jesus is teaching and telling his followers that you should be doing something when it comes to prayer. And he continues and says, everyone who asks receives, whoever seeks finds, to everyone who knocks, the door is open. He doesn't say that the door that you're knocking on is going to open, but if you keep knocking, a door is going to open. And so there's something about persistence. When we think about the practice of prayer as pressing into the unseen, there's something about persistence, and we are just not very persistent as people. We're not very persistent, right? We want the one time. I already did that, all right? I've been there, I've tried that, it didn't work. We don't want the persistence that is required to really press into the unseen through prayer. And the place where Jesus really schools his followers on prayer, where we get the whole Lord's Prayer, is recorded by one of his followers, by an eyewitness named Matthew. And so Jesus is teaching his followers about how to pray and how not to pray. And he says, don't just use a bunch of words. They don't add up. It's not an equation where the more words I use, the more value there is to my prayer. He says, don't use a bunch of words. Don't pray out on the street corner in public to show off. That's how you know we're in a different time and place than when Jesus was teaching. Nobody's going to show off by going to the street corner and praying right now. You're just going to look like a weirdo to go out there and just pray openly, hoping someone sees you and thinks highly of you. That's not going to happen in our culture. I mean, just imagine somebody trying that today. Instead, Jesus says, pray like this. Our Father who is in heaven, uphold the holiness of your name. You've probably learned it and memorized it from a different version than what we're looking at this morning, but this is the beginning of the Lord's Prayer. And then he continues and says, bring in your kingdom so that your will is done on earth as it's done in heaven. Now, what I say next, you're going to want to crucify me for. But please don't tell anybody outside this room that I said this. And I cannot wait to see Jesus face to face one day and to let him know that this line in the prayer that he's teaching is in the wrong place. It's in the wrong place. But you know why it's in the wrong place? Because they're in school in this account. Their school is in session and Jesus is the teacher. And sometimes when you learn things in school, they're kind of out of place. And you're wondering, students, help me out here. You're wondering, will I ever need to know this? Will I ever really need to know this thing that I'm learning right here, right now in this controlled environment? And it's not until one day when you have moved from the school to the street that you realize what you needed from what you learned while you were in school. And so often, church today looks more like school than the street. And so this is in the wrong place. It's supposed to be at the end of the prayer, because Jesus goes on, there's more to this prayer. He says, give us the latest iPhone on the day that it releases. I'm sorry. Give us the bread we need for today. So right now, in just this moment, sustain us with what we need to move forward. And then there's the forgiveness piece again. That's kind of a big deal. Forgive us for the ways we have wronged you, just as we also forgive those who have wronged us. And for those of us that have said this prayer continuously without even thinking about it, think about what you are praying, what you are saying to God. Forgive me only as much as I'm willing to forgive others. That's what we're saying. It's not just as, forgive us for those that have sinned against us, just as, those that I've sinned against you. It's not like like you forgive me, help me forgive others. It's not like that. It's what we are saying is, God, forgive me, but only as much as I will forgive. That's a big deal. when we really think about this and it's not just a rote ritual as part of our lives, what we're really saying with these words. And then Jesus finishes, which I think he's trying to teach us more than help us really know what to say when we pray, is don't lead us into temptation, but rescue us from the evil one. So just remember that there's an enemy. We're not going to make a big deal out of it, but remember that there's an element of battle in all of this, that there is an enemy who would rather see you fail in trying to press into the unseen. Just remember that. Just remember that. Now, there's already been victory, and victory has been won over that evil one, over the enemy. But remember that he's still there. And the reason why we know that part of the prayer that so many of us have memorized is in the wrong place when Jesus teaches it in school, in the controlled environment to his disciples, is because we see Jesus pray it himself when he's on the street. And so when we fast forward to the account in Luke, when Jesus he knows exactly what he's about to face. He knows exactly what he's about to go through. He knows the whole plan. And this is what he says to God. Jesus left and made his way to the Mount of Olives, as was his custom, and the disciples followed him. When he got there, he said to them, "Pray that you won't give in to temptation." Pray that you won't give in to temptation. And when he told them that, he withdrew from them, not far, and he knelt down and he prayed. So this is Jesus, not in school as the teacher. This is Jesus on the street in desperate need. But this is what he prays. He says, "Father, if it's your will, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not my will, but your will must be done." See, here he moves it to the end of the prayer when he's not teaching anymore. He's not teaching. He's moved from the school to the street, and he's praying for himself. And he says, "Lord, I know what's about to happen. I know what I'm about to encounter. I know what I'm about to endure. It's the most painful experience anyone could ever imagine. But if it's your will, it must be done. Do it through me." And so not only do I get the question of how do you pray from people, but I get the question of how do I know that I'm in God's will? And this is so important for us to understand as we press into the unseen. How do I know that I'm in God's will? Why do you want to be in God's will? How do I know that I'm in God's will? I have a feeling that if you're asking to be in God's will, you're pretty close. If that becomes your prayer, "Lord, not my will, but yours be done." See, because we can believe in God and maybe not be in his will and not really experiencing him, but still believe. You can believe from anywhere. You don't have to be in God's will to believe that there's a God. You can believe there's a God from anywhere. And your prayer can even be, "God, wherever you are, if you can hear me, thank you for what I've got. Give me more." That can be your prayer from anywhere, and you can believe in a God and pray like that to a God. But if you're going to be in God's will, that's probably the best place where you're going to experience that God. And your prayer ends up being, "Lord, whatever your will is, let it be mine." And we align our wills with God's. I got one person trained in this crowd out here. She's like, "I know one thing, when he gets loud, I clap." I was like, "Yep. I got one, just got to work on some more." Yeah. That's why it's important to know if we are in the will of God. And how do you know? You know by your prayer. You know by your prayer. You can believe from anywhere. But if you want to experience and you want to press into the unseen, you're going to experience God in his will. And Jesus was about to go through the most painful experience anyone had ever had in this life on this earth. But he knew that he was in God's will, and he knew he could walk right through that pain in God's will. Whatever you're facing, whatever you have going on, whatever is happening in your life with the people whom you love, with the people who you work, the people whom you live, you can go through the most painful experience, and instead of God taking it away, he will lead you through it if you are in his will. He will lead you right through it. And there will be victory on the other side of that pain, on the other side of that experience. Whatever it is that you're walking through right now, you would rather be in incredible pain and in God's will than comfortable anywhere else. And so the question that we have to ask, and as we ask this question, could we experience more of God in whom we profess when pressed, if we press into him? Yes. Yes. Through the practice of prayer as a practice of pressing. And the prayer is persistent. The prayer is one that leads to a place where no matter our circumstance, no matter our condition, no matter what we're facing in life, becomes, Lord, I want to be in your will be done through me. God was about to enact his will through Jesus. God, your will be done through me. If you want to know that you are in God's will, you can tell by your prayers. You can tell by your prayers. Can I pray for you this morning? Father, again, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the way that you are at work, the way that we are experiencing you, the way that you are becoming alive and becoming real in us and through us. And Lord, in those moments when we're wondering where you are, Lord, why we can't see you, are you really there? Do you really exist? In those moments, Lord, we pray that you would reveal yourself to us. And we thank you for this practice of prayer, Lord, this ability to talk with you freely and openly. Lord, we thank you for that gift. And Lord, in those moments when we're curious, when doubt is running rampant through our minds, God, remind us of what you have made possible. Lord, that we can't experience anything that you have not already experienced. God, we thank you for that empathy. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank y'all so much for being here this morning. I hope you have a fantastic week, and we will see you next week.